Welcome to the Black Room. Dr. F. Jas, the man with the numbers.
As always.
And what are we talking about this week, Jas?
Today, we're talking about is the movement as it lost momentum.
Ooh.
It's a good subject to get into right now.
It is.
Because I've got like 2 points of view on this, like 2 angles on this.
Okay.
The first is absolutely. It's lost momentum, bro. If we look at our social media platforms, if we look at our news, if we look at even our local conversations with friendship groups, if we look at what's going on within the workplace, like, is it where it was 6 weeks ago? Absolutely not. I'll keep that brief. My second view, was that reality ever a real reality? So at the front end of this conversation, we were talking about everything being so unique. It felt different this time. We had COVID. The whole world had stopped. That wasn't a sustainable reality. Mm-hmm. So the strength and momentum of the movement at that time, was it always going to feel much, much stronger than a life as normal? And at some point, life was going to return to some form of normality. And are we now, is it not that we've lost momentum, but it's now leveling out with the other things that normally happen in our life anyway?
It's a great question. It's a hard question for me to think about, because to think that momentum has been lost behind something that's so important it feels a bit of a shame. And I guess when we talk about momentum, part of me feels as though we need to qualify what momentum looks like, because actually if we look at the value of social media posts and we look at the bits that were visible, was that ever the bit that was ever going to truly drive meaningful change? You guys, when I've spoken to you and your brother, have talked about 3 phases of the movement, and the first phase that you guys described was almost emotive. It was an acute reaction to a particular event or thing, and that was George Floyd. That was the catalyst. And then everybody took to the streets, right? And everybody marched and protested in the social media and the Blackout Tuesday, and that was good to raise awareness. And then you said something like there's a stage almost where it's consolidation, where people have to sit and think and strategize. Could it be that we are in that phase? Is it that it's just not as prevalent on the mediums that we would consume that type of information? Do you feel as though people are still in the background working on things? Because part of me, if I look at my own situation professionally, part of me thinks, well, there was a thing, and then I kicked off, or we kicked off, and then there are actions, but those actions aren't implementable immediately. You can't address everything straight away. So are we in a stage now where we're consolidating all the conversations that we had and trying to strategize, trying to think about how we operationalize what it is we say we're doing? Or is it actually that genuinely, because the conversations aren't happening, we've lost momentum?
Bro, to be honest, I think it's a bit of both. I genuinely think there's been some momentum lost, but for a number of different reasons. No doubt there are individuals, organizations in the background thinking about what they do. So from my experience with my organization, I'm internalized there. In the front end, we were very outward. We're not really doing that anymore, but I know there are things going on within the organization to still make change and move the dial forward. And that's going to take time, no doubt, and we have to acknowledge that. There'll be some organizations that have gone out on social media and stuff. We hope they're doing things in the background, but they're not. There's the reality. There'll be some that are just not doing anything. And I think the big challenge here is like that strategizing piece. Like the timing of that is super important, right? Because it feels like if the strategizing is going on now in pockets, without it being like at the forefront, suddenly you've got 12 different strategies. Everyone's trying to do, right, we think this bit's important, we think this bit's important. So I feel like if there's 100 things that are important, none of them are going to get done particularly well. So one organisation might do one element like amazingly, but that's just in that organisation now, rather than, and I think I don't know if we've missed the boat on that piece.
The other part that I'm thinking of is when we talk about momentum, to my mind, I've sort of split it quite crudely into two different sort of conceptual ideas. There's the systemic momentum, where we are addressing systemic things that need to be addressed, and that can look, if you look professionally in a corporation, you look at the representation at board level, at senior level, you look at the proportion of people that come from a minority background, and that's one piece of the momentum. The other piece of the momentum to me is the bits that happen almost personally, the interpersonal exchanges that people have. That is the conversations that people have with their social circles, with their colleagues, and that will sort of are recently wrote an article and put it on LinkedIn because I felt like it was that piece that had lost momentum, that the conversations were no longer really happening, those interpersonal exchanges where people are enlightened and people get to hear from a perspective that they would never necessarily hear about. I feel like that piece has lost momentum because I almost feel as though social media is reflective of that piece, right? So interpersonal exchanges often represented on social media, whereas the systemic changes won't necessarily be. You're not going to have Parliament saying today we're debating or this corporation saying today they generally don't tend to do that, and that to me is okay as well. So I guess the short answer to the question is, have we lost momentum? I think you answered that perfectly. I think partially we have lost momentum, and I think that it's important that these interpersonal exchanges, even though they feel small, I feel like it's important that those continue to happen because sometimes that's what feeds the systemic change. That's what feeds the. So I sort of sit on the fence a bit about.
Yeah, and there isn't a definitive answer to this question at this point, I don't believe, because there will be things being done in the background. As I touched on before, my concern is I feel like the background stuff will be spread out. That said, like even within our friendship group, for example, I know the conversation isn't as prevalent, but it's still more frequent than it was before. And we always talk about turning the dial. And we've got to acknowledge that although this has absolutely felt bigger than certainly anything in my lifetime, and it felt like an opportunity to move the dial drastically.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of reasons why it felt so big, and I think there still is a massive opportunity to move the dial. But it's important to acknowledge we are still moving the dial.
Yeah.
This isn't like the start and the end.
Yeah.
This will continue, and I think we need to be straight about that. So, as much as momentum's declining, I think from my personal experience, and I'm hoping from a broader experience, that there is some of those things that are still being sustained and now embedded more fundamentally in like normality. Where it's not something people are raising all the time, it's still happening.
Yeah, I think it's important to bear that in mind when we ask the question, because I think the second you start working on something that doesn't feel like it's necessarily paying off dividends or moving, then you start to feel deflated and then you take your foot off the gas a little bit. And I think it's important to recognise, to your point, that the needle has moved. And so the conversations, whilst they might not be happening as broadly as they were happening at the start of the movement, those conversations have become actually a much bigger part of normality now. It's much easier for people to say, well, actually you can't say that to me because you're taking a mick. And I feel that professionally, absolutely. I feel like people want to know what has your experience been, and people are much more ready to engage in that conversation than historically they would have been, because it has been, it's like the elephant in the room sometimes and nobody really wants to go near, and I feel like that has been addressed. And so to that extent, the momentum that's got us here, even if it did peter out here, part of me says, well, actually we've still moved the dial significantly, because now this is a regular part or a normal part of the dialogue that we exchange in, both personally and professionally, and that's important as well, right?
Definitely.